Welcome back to our Batesville High School Skill Development Series as we get into Year 1, Session 1, Lesson 2. I want to remind us of the DISC assessment wheel that you see here and the four quadrants of it: the dominance, the influence, the steadiness, and compliance. We're going to spend some time breaking down today the natural and adapted graphs on your report and start to do some calculations in this journey. But first, I want to remind ourselves of this. What is our mission? For you to become the world's greatest expert on yourself, using the words and the teachings of a man by the name of Greg Harden, that we understand that for you to best understand yourself is to become the world's greatest expert on yourself. Our vision stays the same, that we want you to become the most desirable applicants through our opportunities, processes, and experiences. And finally, our objective, to be able to answer the first question asked in every interview with confidence. Tell us a little bit about yourself, including your strengths and your weaknesses. Let's dive in today's journey. Today's objective is very simple. We want to look at the four dimensions of observable behavior. Those are the questions that are associated with the D, the I, the S, and the C. Once we define that, we're going to look at the natural versus adapted style, and we'll take a look at our class and group dynamics as we begin this journey in skill development. If you look in the upper right of your report, you'll see this type of graph. And so let's talk about the four different parts of it. You have the D, which stands for dominance, the I, which is influence, the steadiness, which is the S, and the C, which is in compliance. You see that there. You also see the numerical scores at the bottom, ranging from 1 to 100. We'll talk a little bit more about the significance of those. I'm going to direct your attention first to the middle, we call the energy line. That's right at 50. Look at the high score is any score above 50, and the low score is any score below 50. I'm going to make one key distinction here. This is not a good score versus a bad score. A higher score is not a good thing, and a lower score is not a negative. What this is, though, however, is start to put a characteristic, a numerical value to some of your observable behavioral styles. So let's look first at your natural style. This is your DNA. This is kind of who you are. This is where you sit today. In your most comfortable natural environments, this is what you oftentimes default to in typical settings. This is your unique blend. We all have these four observable behavioral traits, and we'll talk about what they mean to you. So as we looked at these combinations together, we'll see what it means to you in your natural style, and then we'll look at what the adaptive style means. These are your standout or observable behaviors. These are typically, not always, but typically how you might respond or how people who have similar traits than you might respond in different situations. And we'll talk through each one of these situations or behavioral styles and how you might respond to these different opportunities. We also want to look at your adaptability. We all know, and typically as you sit here today, even in the classroom, that you're adapting from your normal DNA type of behavior. Those settings, we all work through them, and we all have different settings where we have to adapt. In my own style, I may be different at home versus I am in the office, versus I am in the lunchroom, versus I am in different meetings. We all have different levels of adaptability. What we want to get through in this whole process is when you are adapting, that you're able to identify that and you can start to predict what type of energy levels or what type of characteristics you might need as you go into different settings. This example here shows somebody would be characterized as a high I and a low C. We have two observable behaviors that are above the energy line. You see here the yellow and the green are above the 50, so they would be considered a high I and a high S. And then also you see the two observable behaviors, the D and the C, are below the 50% line, so they would be considered a low C and a low D. The most pronounced high behavioral trait is the I, and the most pronounced low behavioral trait is a C. Again, one is not better than the other, but typically we want to be able to name these so we can start to identify some of the behaviors. So for each one of the DISC assessments and the DISC questions, we have very specific questions that we ask. For the D, how do you typically respond to problems and challenges? We have a high D response and a low D response. For influencing, how do you influence others to your point of view? So typically if you have a high I, there's some characteristics that we're going to explore. And if you're a low I, there's some characteristics that we're going to explore in response to how do you influence others to your point of view. The same with the S. How do you respond to the pace of the environment? If you have a high steadiness score, you typically have responses to the pace of the environment. If you have a low steadiness score, you have typical responses to that. We want to be able to determine the difference of the both. The last one is the compliance. How do you respond often to rules and procedures established by others? Again, there's some adaptability in here based upon how you might act at home versus in a work environment or school, but how do you typically respond based upon your compliance score? Let's look in your report with a natural and adapted graph. So The adaptive style, which we're going to start with, is this when you step in the world when you're typically changing, right? So when you step into school from home, you're automatically adapting. Even going from classroom to classroom, oftentimes you're adapting based upon the rules and the procedures established by each teacher. That also may change when you go into an extracurricular activity or you go into a job setting. Your natural style, again, is your DNA, right? So what we want to first do is create this calculation and look at specific trends. So you see the two questions here. How much am I adapting, right? So we're going to take our adaptive score minus our natural score, and that's become our adapting score. And what correlations do I see? Typically, when somebody adapts, we see if we adapt in one area, we also adapt in the other area. We're going to pause the video now, and you're going to create this calculation and start to look at these two questions. How much am I adapting in a typical environment, and what correlations might I see? Here you see the disc wheel. We're going to look at this from a standpoint of strength. So if you're typically a high D or a high C, you're more of a task-oriented person. You're the type that likes to get stuff done. Typically, you're at a faster pace and you want to accomplish specific tasks. If you're a high I or a high S, typically you're more people-oriented. You like to develop the relationship with individuals first before getting down to business. Then we also look to the right and to the left. So typically high Ds and high Is are often active and extroverted type of individuals. We can start to draw generalities based upon the people we interact with very early on based upon some of their outward behaviors. To the left, the high Cs and the high S's typically are reserved and introverted individuals. Paired together, we can start to make observations about people early on when we start to establish different relationships. Are they task-oriented or are they more people-oriented? Do they tend to be more introverted or extroverted? Are they more reserved? Are they more active and outgoing? These are some traits that we start to draw in it, and you are actually grouped this way in these settings based upon similar disc styles. We'll pause here, and then we're going to insert the graph, the class of 2027, and we'll also insert the graph of the class of 2027 facilitators here. So for our next session, these are the discussions that we're going to look at for our next objective before we begin today's activities. We're going to look specifically based upon your disc style, how do you typically respond to problems and challenges? How do you typically influence others to your point of view? How do you typically respond to the pace of the environment? And how do you typically respond to rules and procedures established by others? I look forward to continuing this journey with you on our skill development series.